to another episode of Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. My name is Mark Rybolt, and I'm the host. And today's episode, we are talking with a new guest for the podcast, Marissa Maldonado, who is a healthcare technology expert. And specifically today, we're talking about adopting cybersecurity practices for hospitals and medical practices. And this is a good discussion where we kind of cover a high level overview of cybersecurity, specifically within the healthcare space. We talk about some of the recent legislation and policy initiatives that have been going on coming out of Washington on this topic. But what we really wanted to do was, after we cover the broad subject from a high level, we wanted to tee up further episodes that will be coming out in a series on this topic and dig into some of these more specific issues and nuances of the discussion in much more detail. So those will be something to look forward to. But again, this was a great conversation. Marissa brings a wealth of knowledge and perspective, having worked with healthcare organizations of all types and sizes all over the country, specifically on cybersecurity. And this is something that applies to literally every organization out there, no matter how small you are, large you are, no matter what services you provide, and no matter what region you're in the country. So there's definitely going to be more on this to come. We hope you enjoy this and will stay tuned for the series. We also want to remind everyone, as usual, that if you like this content, we'd love to hear your feedback. If there's anything you'd like to hear about more, or if there's another topic, any topic that you'd like us to address, please send that info to us. We'd love to get that kind of feedback. You can find us at coffeewithcoker.com. You'll be able to find this episode as well as all of our episodes there, so you can go back to listen to all those. And you can also submit feedback there, or questions and requests as well. You can find us on social media. You can also find us through the main Coker website. That's cokergroup.com. So we thank you for listening, and we look forward to talking with Marissa here today. All right. Well, welcome back for another episode. Today, we're talking about cybersecurity. And as I mentioned in the intro, we have a guest with his first time on the podcast, but it is Marissa Maldonado. So welcome, Marissa.
Thanks.
We've worked with Marissa and her company for a long time, and she brings a lot of expertise as it relates to all things IT. And specifically, though, as I said, we're talking about cybersecurity. And even more specifically than that, we're talking about how to adopt cybersecurity practices. And I know this is something, obviously, that's on the mind of every healthcare organization out there, no matter how small, how large. And it's a constant daily thing, sometimes a daily struggle for sure. And so there's also plenty of examples of stories coming out, whether it's in the media or social media or whatever it may be, around the impact of cybersecurity specifically in healthcare. And so this is something Coker does a lot of, and we thought we definitely wanted to talk about it. And we're going to have the initial content of what will ultimately be a series of content. And the stuff we're talking about today, actually, Marissa is going to have a white paper on in the near future. So we'll make sure everybody has access to that. But now I think this is a good way to tee off the subject. Before we, I guess, dive in and discuss how to prevent things like data breaches and security breaches, maybe first talk about the motivation behind malicious groups and why is this stuff even happening? What is happening and why?
Sure. When I come and sit and talk to people about this, you always see a lot of terrified looks across the stage. And I kind of okay, let's take a deep breath. I don't want us to understand this is not the end of the world as we know it. It's just an evolution of people taking advantage of others and gaining a profit from it. I like to kind of compare to it's our modern day pirates. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of different groups that are very important for us to understand the difference. So one is nation state actors. that's going to be really targeted attacks that are going to be coming in to cause a disruption to society. So, of course, those are a lot more terrifying, and you see them being mentioned in the news, and I think we're kind of catching up to how to react to those. So those are going to be for political gain. Cyber criminals are the pesky ones, are the ones that we hear about, or the ones that we as people and business owners are going to be affected by. So these are people that are here to make money off of us. And when we talk about, well, who are these people, and this is terrible, and why are we not doing anything about it? Well, the problem is with the advancement of technology and the ability to share and communicate across the world, we can also affect and infect the environments across the world. So we're talking about white-collared workers in different countries that have a quota to meet. I need to make a certain amount of money based on our best practices of cyber activity. So there's really interesting articles of profiles of these people that they're outstanding citizens in their community. They go to church. They have kids. People know what they do. And in certain areas, it's really seen as the Robin Hood of the 21st century. You're stealing from the rich, from America, from medical groups and people with a lot of money, and you're bringing that money back into your communities. And then, of course, my favorite, hacktivists. So hacktivists are fun groups around the world that are doing it not for political gain and causing cyber war. These are people that are doing it to make a statement. It's really interesting with hacktivists. There's actually a moral code within these organizations. One is called Anonymous, which is a pretty familiar one here in the United States. And several years ago, they were actually doing a attack on Boston Children's Hospital. And the hierarchy of this hacktivist group actually came out and said, this is not something that we do. We will not disrupt children being treated. And just like a snap of a finger, the attack stopped. So there's actually a moral code of hacktivists. So I think really what we're talking about here is truly those cyber criminals. There's a lot more of them. They're a lot more aggressive. And they don't care who you are. They just want to find ways to make money off of you.
Sure. I think it's interesting too, because I know you do talk to a lot of groups and at conferences and such about this topic. And I imagine you probably get a lot of the, like you said, kind of either really overwhelmed, thinking, oh my gosh, how could this be happening or out there? You probably get a lot of, not necessarily eye rolls, but kind of like, oh boy, more money we have to put into the budget for this and those types of things. So a little bit of, it's a burden more than an opportunity, I guess. You get that a good bit, or is it kind of like, no, we all realize this is out there. We have to take it seriously.
I see a hybrid of both. I'm very excited when I talk to CFOs who understand this is a priority and we need to have this on the top of our conversation. And really see it not as a burden that, oh, it's fine. We'll
deal with it if it ever happens.
It won't happen to us. Yeah, exactly. But people are starting to listen because it's starting to happen at a higher rate. I will tell you, in 2018, the number of BEC, business email compromises, was astonishing. What we've had, and we can dive into this too, not to get too nerdy technical with you, but kind of all the protocols that we've done up until this point, it's been a cat and mouse game. I create code and I find a way to penetrate your environment. I, as a cybersecurity protector, find a way to create other code, antibodies to your virus to protect my environment from you. I've got my firewalls. I've got my antivirus. I have all of these security best practices to stop it from happening from the technical side. And that's pretty much standard now. when we get a home, we have locks on our doors.
Sure.
We have locks on our window, and we might have a security system.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that we're seeing now is, even with all of those things in place, we are not aggressively addressing the human firewall component of it. Essentially, the person that opens the door to the bad actor, the person that's going to come in your house and steal all of your jewelry, from coming in and walking in. So that's the biggest part of it, because now I have a wider reach. Before, I had to get past one firewall and do all the security mechanisms to do what I needed to do to penetrate it. Now I can reach out to 150 employees, and one of those employees is going to let me into their network.
Yeah. I think that's become more common to see that, where they're just looking for one open little chink in the armor.
Yep.
I imagine the perspective on this topic for a Boston Children's or a large major health system, or a large hospital in a urban metropolitan base area. This is kind of, they understand that reality. But do you get any of the we're just a little, we're only a 3-doctor practice here, but when you think about that, a 3-doctor practice not only still has a number of employees, and they have thousands probably of patient records that have personal health information, as well as potentially financial information, certainly identifying information that can be exploited. I mean, is it pretty much a kind of equal opportunity penetrator here? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, because they have the misconception of, I'm too small.
Sure.
Why would you take the time to target me? It's not that they're targeting you, it's they're casting a net out and finding how many little fishies are caught up in that net. So, for example, 60% of small businesses go out of business within 6 months of an attack. And I see that in the medical industry as well, because we have that push and pull, independent practices versus being purchased and being acquired through hospital systems. Sure. A lot of the time, that trigger is, I had a security breach and I don't know what to do about it. Do I report it? What do I do? I'm scared. You know what? Just buy me. Go ahead, and I just want to be acquired by a larger organization. So you see that trend because of the fact that these people are scared. These organizations don't know what to do. I would say in 2017, so we don't have the official 2018 final numbers because we're still pretty fresh into the new year. Cyber attacks cost small and medium-sized businesses an average of $2.2 million. And 58% of malware attacks are on small businesses. So now we can get into the fun of statistics and causation and relation and all of that. But what essentially this means is there's a lot more small businesses out there than large.
And let's face it, $2.2 million means, I think you just have to acknowledge the fact that it means a lot more to a small business maybe than perhaps a large corporation. Now, sure, issues that happen in a large corporation, a large organization, those costs are probably going to be greater, obviously, that, just the numbers and volume and scale there. But still, I mean, that's not money that, to your point about a practice, for instance, if there is some incident or exposure there, that they probably don't have a lot of wiggle room in the budget for dealing with that. So like you said, they may have to just resolve to whatever, getting bailed out or changing something, downsizing significantly, cutting workforce.
Right. Or worse, sweeping it under the rug.
Or ignoring it. And
then it becoming a worse problem.
Sure.
I see within small practices how many people use yahoo.com, AOL.com email addresses. And then the question is, do you have PHI information in those emails? No, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
That means yes, you do.
Right.
And you need to get off of those systems. There's a lot of solutions out there that are manageable for small businesses and medium and these large specialty groups.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because when you think about PHI, I know just other work that we've done with whether it's a practice or on the hospital side, we'll ask for data for doing, and it may be something completely unrelated. It may be doing a physician compensation analysis or evaluation, and we ask for certain data, and what we get back, we specifically say, by the way, we do not send us anything with PHI, but what we get back ends up inevitably having something like that.
Right.
We didn't want it. We didn't ask for it. They probably didn't really even intend to send it. Mm-hmm. But it's just maybe a lack of awareness, or the systems aren't set up to reduce that from happening, that possibility, things like that. And it's purely an accident maybe, or unintentional, but there's still consequences tied to it potentially.
Right. Absolutely. The full scope of PHI and where it's lurking within an environment usually is a pretty astonishing conversation with the business owners and the practices that some of them don't even have a clue. Yeah.
Well, and I know we'll probably revisit that in the future in terms of how we can kind of mitigate that and prepare, I guess.
Right. That's a whole other conversation.
It is. Well, I know one of the things you're talking about in your white paper, and I've heard you mention it before, but you mentioned cybersecurity protocols as being kind of having been in the Wild West. Why is that? Maybe explain that a little bit further and where we're ultimately at today.
Sure. Everyone is running to catch up with what's happening. You have the cat and mouse game, and it's happening at a very high rate because there's a lot of money to be made.
Sure.
And there are quotas for people to make. And once again, going back to the cybercriminals, there are families to feed that they need to make their money. Mm-hmm. So, it's been a lot of, okay, do this. Okay, do this. Here's the best practice. All right. Okay, we're going to do multi-factor authentication and emails. 365 runs to catch up, and then the system doesn't work quite well at the beginning. So it's this constant aiming and shooting at a moving target constantly. So, of course, from the government perspective, it's very hard for us to say, these are the things that you have to do. You must do these. Absolutely. Some people don't have the resources, the time, the knowledge to do these things, or sometimes they're not applicable to their environment. So it's a constant best practices. Do your best. Do this. Do that. And it's really been I have so many questions, I don't even know where to start, and I have no guidelines of what I should be doing. Now, in 2015, we had the Cybersecurity Act, CSA, and it basically was a call to arms for focusing on improving our critical infrastructures to better handle cybersecurity concerns. Within that act, which, if you want to get super technical, is 405D, as in dog, it involves aligning healthcare industry security approaches. All right, so that was in 2015. Let's talk about what's happened between 2015 and February 2019. We saw the reintroduction of ransomware. We saw an uptick in phishing. We've seen a lot of change in velocity of what's happening in the cybersecurity world. Perfect example, let's talk about Collection 1 for a second. So Collection 1 was a release of data, which was a phenomenal experience. It happened actually a month ago, and we saw immediate problems with it, with people coming to us, where all of a sudden they were using Yahoo and they got kicked out of their email system, and then they actually changed their emails and held their emails hostage. Yeah. And basically what Collection 1 is, it's not I broke into a system and I'm doing a data dump. It is, I have been collecting data for a long time, and I've organized the data and I've put it into very clear code so you can see the passwords. And now I'm selling it on the dark web. It's one of the largest data dumps that we've seen in history. So a lot has happened in 3 years.
So Collection 1, is it a group, or is it just like a methodology that groups have adopted? Or
it's a group or a person. We don't know who it is. And apparently the theory is there might be 6 different collections that are going to slowly be put onto the dark web.
But they're using this tactic, and it's obviously working.
They're selling it. They're getting really good money off of it.
There's a market for it.
Yeah. And the question is, well, what are they going to do with that data? Well, I might sell it to one of my cyber criminals organizations, and now I have a data set. Now I'm going to try using that and seeing if I can get into your networks. Most of the time, people probably use the same password, maybe a variation of it, maybe 2 to 5 passwords that they use across all of their platforms. So if you're using your work email password at LinkedIn or way back when MySpace, and that password is still being used, I can try other different tactics and get into your system. So it's not a step 1, 2.
Yeah.
It's step 1, 1058, and all of a sudden, boom, I'm in your environment. So I was really excited to see, actually this late December, they finally released a publication in response to 405D of the CSA Security Act. It is called the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practice, Managing Threats and Protecting Patients. The acronym is HICP. So at first I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit. I have to admit, I'm like, okay, 3 years later, thanks.
Yeah,
we've been all on a burning, sinking ship. Nice of you to meet up with us.
Just playing catch up at this point.
Exactly.
Who did release that?
So this was in publication with HHS, the Health and Human Services. Yeah. So this is basically them coming out and releasing these best practices. So basically what they did for the past 3 years is started doing a lot of analytics and understanding of what's happening. The methodology of how they presented this information is fantastic. Not for the cybersecurity professional. It's fantastic for the practices, the owners, the physicians. It is an applicable document where they can understand and interpret what we're talking about. So in this, the HICP, here's kind of a quote from basically their guidelines. So this is their summary of it. So HICP, it's a common set of voluntary, consensus-based, and industry-led guidelines, best practices, methodologies, procedures, and processes to achieve 3 core goals. Goal number 1, cost effectively, who doesn't like that word? Cost effectively reduce cybersecurity risk for a range of healthcare organizations. Okay, great. This actually might mean it's applicable to me, my small one-man shop.
And I don't have to, increase our IT budget by 1,000% to do it.
And I don't have to hire someone to interpret this report and tell me the best practices. Goal number 2, support the voluntary adoption and implementation of its recommendations. Again, this is voluntary, but we want to support you in this process, and we highly recommend that you do it.
Yeah, and maybe we'll talk about that later or even separately down the road, but I do eventually want to come back to that because I think the healthcare industry is, particularly on healthcare technology-related topics and issues, I think is a little notorious for we'd really like you to do this, and we're going to support you in doing this, but what does support mean, Right. And I mean, what does that really look like? And if it's voluntary, sometimes it's a different level of importance and priority to people and organizations versus the whole carrot and the stick discussion. And again, we're not there yet, so we don't need to drill into it. But I just wanted to mention that because I got to think what's going on now is just literally grazing the surface on hopefully what will come on this. But
for sure. I mean, I would just think about it. The nature of the industry, the fact that we have continued to go more into all things electric, all things electronical, all things in the cloud. We are continuously moving into this magical world that we call the cloud. Why do we do that? Because I don't want to be bound by my infrastructure. I want to be able to have my doctors, finish doing what they need to do at home and not having to do complicated VPN connections back into the networks, which is expensive. I want to be able to start reducing my infrastructure. Purchasing servers and being infrastructure heavy is slowly going to the wayside because it's expensive and there's better solutions out there.
Yeah.
But
there's a cost.
There's a cost to it, and we're experiencing that cost because I, as a malicious actor, have a treasure trove if I get into your system. It's a lot easier for me to ask for your password than trying to hack in and bypass all of your firewalls and all of your security mechanisms to get into your infrastructure.
Sorry, that's huge. I think the differentiation between them gaining access and someone essentially granting access.
Yep, exactly.
And from there, it's just snowball.
Yeah, you look at the security breaches that are happening. A lot of it is victim of a phishing email, victim of this, victim of this. It's you rarely see I specifically targeted you. And I got into your system and I was sitting in the system and just reading and analyzing. You hear about that in the political world. We all know about, the questions about people getting into the emails and all that. I mean, those, again, you see the difference. That's a political motivation where I'm going to take the time. I mean, the best analogy I would say is going back into the analogy of the house. All right. I'm building a house. I put locks on my doors. I lock my windows. I'm going to take it a step further. I'm going to put a security system in place. Cool. I'm going to have a security system. I'm going to do motion detection, shatterproof on the window. So I'm adding more. It's more expensive, but keep adding. Now I'm going to get really, really technical on this. I'm going to build a moat around my house. I'm super important. So I want to have protection and, I don't want to get kidnapped because, it's going to be a lot of money. So I'm going to build a moat. I'm going to put some alligators and some scary little animals in that moat. So if you try and cross and you're going to be eaten alive. But of course I have a bridge because I need to get into my house. I am set. I am super secure. Okay, so for those flyby cyber criminals that are coming through, sure. Now, let's say I'm a targeted. I'm a bad actor and I'm targeting you specifically. You do see that within hospital systems. There might be political gain. There are a lot of key players that are involved in these larger organizations. Hence, we'll go back into HICP, why there is a differentiation between small, medium, large organizations. Now I'm sitting on a hilltop and I'm watching you add all these security mechanisms in place. I am learning your behavior. Now I'm watching who's crossing the moat. How do people lower that bridge? How do they get in? Who are they talking to? Who's granting them access?
Times,
yep.
Yep.
And I'm going to be very patient. It might take me years, but I will eventually know your vulnerability and then walk across that bridge. The bridge will be drawn. I won't get be eaten by animals. And I'll knock on the door and they'll say, "Oh, awesome. The electrician is here. Come on inside." And now I have access into your environment.
Yep.
The same analogy goes with our third-party vendors. This is a very important thing and another whole other conversation, but what are we doing to address our third-party vendors? Because if I want to target you and I want to gain access into your system, a lot of these big breaches that we've seen happen, that's how they got in, through the third-party vendors. So what are they doing to protect themselves? Again, targeted. I'm watching you. I'm understanding the systems that you use. So there's a lot of different ways of getting in. And going back to the HICP, they really are, of course, saying it's voluntary, but they've taken the time to look at all the different scenarios and put a clear framework in place. Now, of course, in this, it's in adherence with NIST, which is, our cybersecurity framework, which consists of 5 concurrent and continuous functions that constitute the cybersecurity lifecycle for an organization, which is 1, identify, 2, protect, 3, detect, 4, respond, and 5, recover. Who's going to remember that?
Right.
What does that even mean?
Yeah.
So going back to HICP, which is written in common language, the goal number 3 of this is ensure on an ongoing basis that content is actionable, practical, and relevant to healthcare stakeholders of every size and resource level. Mm-hmm. So essentially they said, okay, we're gonna simplify this as much as possible and make it applicable to everyone.
And realistic for you to do regardless of size, resources, scale, and all that stuff, which is, I think, the most critical point, because that truly does make this meaningful, or at least sets a foundation for what's to come being meaningful in the future.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, going back to the house analogy, okay, I'm not a bajillionaire that needs to have, man-eating animals to protect you from coming to my house, but I do need locks on my door.
Sure.
I do need a key to get into my, I need those basic steps.
Well, and even the security system, right? There's kind of a progression to that. You got to have the company, and they come in and they evaluate. And I mean, so it's not overwhelming, but there is a process to it,
right?
And there is a cost to it, and time, and all of that. So,
and that's a really important thing that you just brought up. It's a continuous evolution of your security posture. It is not okay, it's October, it's cybersecurity month, let's go ahead and put some things in. We have a budget. Okay, great, thank you. Check that off of our list. It is something that you constantly have to be talking about. It is so, so, so important to ensure that you are creating a culture within your organization about cybersecurity.
Yeah, and one of the things I was just thinking about this, you're talking about third-party vendors and different access points, things like that, different kind of vulnerabilities. And, I've done a lot of work on transactions, right? And whether it's a I've seen hospitals acquiring other hospitals, and one part of due diligence is, at some point mapping out the different IT systems. And, I've seen some of these things, and you're talking hundreds of different software solutions, infrastructure components, vendors, third party, different third parties, whatever they may be involved. And just thinking about covering all of those things is almost like overwhelming to even try to conceptualize. But even on you alluded to earlier, the hospitals acquiring and aligning with practices, right? We're seeing, obviously that's been going on for years, and we're continuing to see a lot of it, and I think we will continue to see it in the future. But, getting ahead of that curve and thinking about it in a way that first of all, isn't after the fact. It's not a reactive effort, but there's some proactivity to it, but also consistency across the board, because I've seen health systems acquiring groups, and the hospital may be among many different smaller vendors, but maybe they're Epic or Cerner or Shop or whatever, but they're acquiring groups that have a dozen, half dozen, whatever it may be, different solutions they're on. So just integrating them and communicating with them, and then put on top of that, you alluded to earlier, the challenge, the doctors having to learn a new system, and the providers having to, work with limited or poor infrastructure or connectivity and access and things like that. I mean, that can really break down quick. And thinking about the potential vulnerabilities in there, it's mind-boggling, because I can't even begin to count and think about all the different vulnerability points, just because there are probably so many.
Yeah, and it's tough because you want to make sure that there's situations where you're aligning with large hospital systems, you're doing it for the right reasons, you're not doing it out of fear and reactive, like you said. And of course, there is that philosophy of how, aggressive as a hospital system do I want to be in saying, you've got to change everything, and you're going to take our system and our infrastructure, and we're going to change everything. You're going to have to train your doctor. It's a lot. And especially when in the medical world, The physicians, they want to focus on providing quality care for their patients,
Sure,
as they should. So I understand it from that perspective of why it gets pushed aside. But like you said, if I have a unique infrastructure within my system, all of those vendors, who's keeping up with those BAs? Who's keeping up with the due diligence on those vendors and making sure they're doing what they need to do? I want to see your security risk assessments. I want to know how often you're doing these every year. I want that documentation. I want you to sign off on it. I want to know you're protecting your assets, which as a result are protecting mine.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of work. So what happens is, in that debate, most of the time, especially if there's a lot of owning physicians that are sitting around that table having this conversation, they're going to win in these arguments.
Sure. Yeah.
And I understand it.
We'll compromise on the risk piece in order to please the preferences.
I want to see X number of patients. Please do not add 5 more clicks to my day. I see it every day.
Oh, yeah.
Doctors are very, very methodical. They're like, so 5 clicks takes me this many seconds.
Sure.
Now I'm going to times that by how many patients I see. And then that's going to take X amount of hours out of my entire year. And I get it. That just shows you how busy they are too. That time matters. Absolutely.
And it's valuable, which I think is another big point here, because a lot of the things we've talked about or referenced are more on the compliance side, which is more of a risk mitigation, risk minimization thing. We haven't even, and again, this is a totally different conversation for another day, talked about the optimization piece, but the value associated with that, because let's face it, there's a lot of value for the health system to keep those providers from having to spend whatever that additional amount of time is for those additional clicks or whatever it may be. So there's not just the compliance piece, but what is the financial impact to this, or the value of not doing it, which I think is interesting, because I know one of the things you're going to talk about in the white paper is some perspectives on, breaking down what is the threat and how do you view this. And, I think I like the discussion here, because once we understand the threat and vulnerabilities a little bit better, I feel like we can then start to think about the optimization piece and the value component to it. And, how can we all benefit, not just minimize risk, the downside, but maximize potential value on the upside. But maybe talk about that and threats and vulnerabilities.
Yeah. My nerd hat went on when I continued reading further into this government document. I kind of it was on a weekend night, and I was like, okay, this is gonna be super boring, but let's dive into it. Let's interpret and digest it. And I was kind of almost giddy. I'm embarrassed to even admit that.
Boy, Marissa, you're really living the dream over there.
I sure am. So don't even get me started about statistics. Whew, goodness gracious. But I'm a big fan of analogies, because my whole goal is to humanize IT. Bring it to your level. Take the time to talk to you about it so you understand it. It's the same thing that physicians do with their patients, right? I want to interpret what's going on with your body, and so you can understand it, and it can help kind of relieve a little bit of anxiety of the unknown. Same thing with cybersecurity. It's sometimes this big scary beast that people either, okay, I'm just going to throw some money on it and you guys just take care of it, and I just see this as
hope for the best.
Hope for the best. Say a little prayer and let's do this. It's the same thing. And for the longest time, when I'm standing in front of a bunch of physicians and talking about cybersecurity at conferences, I like to just change the whole conversation to something that they understand. Flus, viruses, diseases, things that are affecting their patients. See cybersecurity and the threats as those diseases. I'm a virus. I evolve. There are things that I can do to prevent it. It's the same thing with cybersecurity. And even if you look at talking about the history of ransomware, and I know again, a whole other conversation about the history of ransomware. Sure. it's not a new thing.
Yeah, right.
When people say, oh, it is new and it was introduced in 2006.
This all of a sudden started happening out of the blue. No.
It has been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
What changed was cyber criminals learned how to make money off of it. How do they make money off of it? The beautiful thing that we understand now as Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That was what triggered the onset of all of this.
Well, and even going beyond that, just the fact that there is a market for it.
Yep.
I mean, the fact that they can make money off it has created a market. And as much as we wish it wasn't out there, there's demand.
Right. Absolutely. And so, going back to this beautiful analogy, maybe I like to pat myself on the back and pretend that they wrote this paper because they listened to some of my presentations at conferences.
I'm sure. And no doubt that's what it was. They'll be making updates after this podcast
For
as well.
For sure.
So.
Yeah. They can call me anytime.
That's right.
Especially on the weekends.
That's right. Yeah, obviously.
Reading my government papers. So in the analogy, they interpret and they follow this analogy through the rest of the document. They say a threat, see it as a flu. All right. So a cybersecurity threat is I got a flu. Now, in this, we then dive into what are those different threats. And the HICP documentation basically identifies 5, which is great that they slimmed it down to 5.
Yeah, that almost seems 5 is a lot to begin with if you're talking threats, but I'm sure there's others as well, or they're different. But I think before you go through the 5, one interesting point about this analogy that I really like too, and you kind of alluded to it, but the flu every year morphs and evolves and is different, right? And so each flu shot we get every year, for instance, is different from the last one, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But it's a little still that, kind of understanding what's happening, understanding what the threat is and adjusting for it. So going back to your earlier point on the kind of continuous effort here, it's not that you just deal with the flu once and get a vaccination for it as a baby and it never affects you. This is something that is yearly, regularly, and sometimes you even got to adjust when it doesn't work.
Absolutely. And that's just such a great point to drive home. And again, a whole other conversation for another day. But within these, they continue to evolve because they want to get through.
Yeah.
So,
and they learn that behavior.
Exactly.
And so they adjust.
Right.
Just like your security system has to adjust.
Exactly. But a lot of the time, fortunately, we have a solution, but unfortunately, it's a reaction to a new threat.
Yeah.
Now, our job is to try to do everything in our power to identify the threat before it happens, but that's not going to happen all the time. There's so much money involved in it. Of course, they're going to have the best of the best resources trying to find other ways in. So one of the things, if you who are listening can take one bit of information from this, so you can take a deep breath after and maybe sleep a little bit better. It's not a matter of if we have an incident. It's a matter of when we have an incident. What is our incident response plan? It's got to be so tight-knit and ready to go because it's a matter of when. Now, I don't want to sound like an alarmist because an incident might be something super small.
Yeah.
It might be someone was spoofing an email and it was such a flagrantly easy thing to spot. And then hey, I want you to, hi, it's me, the CEO. Can you purchase a bunch of gift cards and send me the thing because I'm at the thing and I want to make these people feel happy? Oh, sure. Okay. Now I just gave up about, $1,000, maybe $10,000. So it can be even small, but it's going to happen.
Yeah.
No matter what. So it's important for us to understand the threats, be prepared for those threats, and understand the difference between an incident and a breach. A breach, we have a bigger problem. An incident, we need to respond to it. We need to make sure we do what we need to do. The same thing with the flu. We need to make sure that we get some rest and we drink a lot of fluids. We need to do something about it. But don't kick yourself over the fact that you got the flu. It happens.
Yeah.
And so going back down into this conversation, so now we're going to talk about, so we talk about threats. Now let's talk about vulnerabilities. So people would talk about, well, I need to do my vulnerability assessment. I need to do this. What are my vulnerabilities? So again, following that analogy of a flu, my vulnerabilities would be, I have a weak immune system. Maybe I'm not getting enough rest. Maybe I'm not drinking enough water. I'm doing something in my behavior that is causing me to have a weak immune system. I don't have a flu shot. I don't know why. I got my flu shot and I got $10 at the grocery store. It was awesome. I was like, sure, sign me up. Let's do it. I don't wash my hands. I go to the bathroom. I don't wash my hands. And at some point in the day, I'm touching my face. So those are what we would refer to as vulnerabilities. What are our behaviors or lack thereof that would cause me to become a victim of a threat? So then you go back further into it is my impact. So the threat is a flu. My impact would be, I got the flu. Now that kind of is like, well, okay, duh.
Right.
But let's talk about what type of flu. How serious of a flu.
And let's face it, getting the flu in, metropolitan area of the United States may be different from, a developing country in Central America or whatever.
Correct.
But even the difference in healthcare access, not just maybe it's a metropolitan area versus a rural area where going into the doctor is not only time consuming, but it may detract from your work, your job, or whatever. But also you get into coverage. How many flu patients have we seen in the ER, and what is the impact there?
Right.
And I mean things like that where it's kind of hard to even quantify that, or it is more than just the patient got the flu, I guess is the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you look at, again, I'll put my technical nerd hat on. What happens if we have an epidemic? Right? That's a scary thing. CDC does what it needs to do. We do everything in our power to mitigate that from happening from the biological perspective. What if we have a cybersecurity epidemic? What does that mean? Okay, so an epidemic would be something like we have a wide range DDoS attack. And, 2-second summarization of DDoS is I've created a virtual traffic jam and have shut down a system because traffic can't come in and it can't go out because I've created a lot of zombie bots and they're all pointing over there and they've created a jam. Why would you do that? What type of infrastructure would cause that sort of epidemic? Okay, we see it in a lot of, going back to nation-state actors. We have seen it in situations like in the UK, in the hospital systems over there. We've seen it in basically shutting down utility infrastructures. And we've actually seen it in the United States as well when they actually did a DDoS attack on our DNS, which is basically the routing of traffic. Okay, well, why would that be a problem? We are in a cloud-based environment. If I can't go to my cloud-based EHR system, I have a problem.
Yeah, right.
So again, in those situations, my impact could be a lot different if I have an epidemic.
Well, I mean, you could even probably simplify it even further than that. What about just think about power outages and the impact that has on us being so reliant on our phones and communication devices. So, in a healthcare setting, again, think about how reliant providers are on information. Very important information. This isn't, stuff you can fluff off, obviously. And so you just, are flying by the seat of your pants to a certain extent if that were to happen. That's fairly simple. You'd like to think and hope the infrastructure can support it, but what are the guarantees?
Right. And, again, going back to we're trying to be as proactive in our responses and to mitigate the impact, but it's a cat and mouse game. They're going to do what they can do to cause a little bit more chaos than we're ready for. And then so in all of this, which is also why we have a Cybersecurity Act that was of 2015, because there is a component to all of this that goes outside of even healthcare. It's about the stabilization of the digital world that we know of today. And it's the best practices. So back to the flu analogy, what would be the best practices in order to mitigate the risk of having an impact, of getting the flu? Okay, I'm going to get a flu shot. I'm going to wash my hands. I'm going to boost my immune system and make sure I'm drinking water and getting the proper amount of sleep and eating more whole foods. So what are the behavior that I can do today in order to prevent myself from becoming a victim of this impact? And why this right here, the practices, is so important for everyone to understand. And even this dives further into, this is something that we should be able to take home with us to our children and talk about, is we as a group need to perform these best practices in order to protect everyone. It's pretty intense when you start to think about it that way. And I don't like, we're changing the world right now, but it's important to look at it from that outside perspective. It's more than just, I can't work today. Okay.
Yeah. And I think the other good thing about it is, again, it's proactive. So it's putting the power a little bit more in our hands, as opposed to just kind of, like we said, hoping for the best or waiting for it to happen. Because obviously there's going to be a reactionary response if and when it does happen. Sure, we got to be ready for that. We got to be prepared. But in the meantime, let's do everything we can to not ever have to go through that process.
Exactly. And that's the key. Let's do everything that we can.
Sure.
There's always going to be something that happens. There's going to be someone sneezed in my face.
Sure.
I've done everything that I possibly could, but I'm sick now.
Yeah.
What can you do? Now you just got to be prepared and understand what are the next steps for me? What is my response to this? I'm going to take a day off. I'm going to isolate myself so I don't spread it.
Right.
Again, the same concept in the cybersecurity world. We're going to isolate the threat, and we're going to do remediation to help reduce that impact and address those vulnerabilities in order to prevent it from continuously happening, and now adjust our behavior and do best practices.
Sure.
So it all comes together.
Full circle. Maybe talk briefly about, you mentioned or referenced the threats they identified in the HICP, and then I want to talk a little bit, and again, as we've said before, we'll have additional deeper dives on some of these different things that we brought up, but at least I'd like to cover some of the best practices that have been identified so that we can at least tee that conversation up and maybe be able to dovetail it into another discussion or discussions about, how can we really take this and put it into action?
Sure, absolutely. All right, so here are our 5 threats identified. It took 3 years to do this summarization. And at first, like I said at the beginning of this, I kind of scoffed at it. Okay, great. Thanks for catching up.
Yeah.
They did a really good job. And I'll tell you why, and I'll kind of just brush on this really quickly, and then we can dive deeper into this in further series, because each one of these threats is a whole conversation of itself. So threat number 1, email phishing attacks. I'd like us to also notice that it is number 1. Number 2, ransomware attacks. Number 3, loss or theft of equipment or data. 4, insider, accidental, or intentional data loss. 5, attacks against connected medical devices that may affect patient safety. 5 sounds like the scariest one because we're talking about heart monitors, things that are, pacemakers, things that are keeping us alive. That's a little bit more difficult to get into. So it's kind of, it's important to discuss, but the possibility of it is a little bit less than our email phishing attacks.
Well, I do, and we won't talk about this now, but again, just to kind of tee it up, the thing that jumped out to me with there is not only what you mentioned with devices, but as we talk and move more and more into telehealth.
Yep.
I think that there's plenty of discussion around potential vulnerabilities there. So each one of these brings up multiple questions, and you're exactly right. A lot more conversation and drilling down into what do these things really mean, look like, and how do we deal with them, that type of thing. But,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so
that covers a lot, though.
So the threats, so those 5 threats, again, those are the 5 diseases that can make me sick, right? Now we talk about the best practices, the 5 behaviors that I can do in order to prevent me from experiencing an impact of these threats. So the 10 technical best practices, I'll kind of list them off, and I apologize for just, here's my list. But 1, email protection systems. 2, endpoint protection systems. 3, access management. 4, data protection and loss prevention. 5, asset management. 6, network management. 7, vulnerability management. 8, incident response. We're almost done. 9, medical device security. 10, cybersecurity policies. Now, okay, so we just said this list. I've already started to zone you out. Great, this is going to be complicated. Now, here is the key of why HICP documentation is so great. What they've done is, of those 10 practices, they have subdivided them into what are the sub practices of each of these 10 for a small organization, a medium organization, and a large organization.
So we can take these 10 kind of big issues. They've digested them a little bit for us, and even broken it down by, hey, I'm more of a small business, a smaller organization here, so break it down even further so that it's meaningful specifically for me.
Exactly. And that, when I saw that framework, it was thank goodness you get it.
Yeah.
And now we can come back to all sorts of different variations of medical practices and have an applicable, tangible North Star to dive into.
Well, you got a good foundation or starting point to start digesting some of this, because it is. It just seems like it's overwhelming and never ending. So
it is.
Yeah, but and we'll make sure there's a link to that, because those lists that they provided already, and then I know you're going to cover them more specifically in the white paper. But again, each one of these 10, I feel like it's something we could talk about, but there's definitely takeaways for each one, I'm sure, as far as dealing with them or preparing against them.
Absolutely. It can seem like a daunting task to do what we need to do to protect ourselves and our data and our patients' data, but let's take one bite at a time and let's dive into these best practices.
Yeah. And again, a systematic approach for it that allows, you don't have to just dive into the deep end first. There is a progression that can happen here.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's critical, particularly as we work with clients, because again, I think a lot of this does seem so overwhelming. A lot of what we do, a lot of what we're doing is helping them just break things down and start dealing with something that, yes, it's big, it's major, it's going to be time consuming, but it doesn't have to be done overnight either.
Exactly. It shouldn't be done overnight.
That's right.
These 10 best practices, we should be talking about them slowly, methodically, for the lifespan of our organization.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not develop a plan and put it on a shelf and check it off the list.
Nope, because by the time you put it on the shelf, there's a whole new variation to the threat.
That's right. Well, I think that's probably a great point to kind of in this discussion, because again, I feel like we can tee up a lot more stuff, and I know we're going to have a lot of follow-up on this, but I think that's the biggest takeaway too, is that this doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to break the bank. It doesn't have to be, life ending for a business out there, particularly a healthcare organization that has a lot of different priorities.
Exactly, because maybe I don't have the means to get a flu shot, but I can go and wash my hands.
Absolutely. Yep. That's exactly right. Well, this has been extremely helpful and just an intriguing discussion that I like it, because I'm not a technical person, but as, someone that works with business leaders and management teams, this is it's on the horizon. It's on the radar for every organization. And like you said, it doesn't go away. It only gets, continues to grow and evolve. So I like this because it's dealing with something tangible, real, is happening right now. And it's stuff that there are steps that can be taken to deal with it. And so I know we're going to be talking about that more in the future. So hopefully all of our listeners will take this and stay tuned. But thanks so much for teeing this up. And I really look forward to further discussion. So
yeah,
thanks.
Absolutely.
All right. We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.